Hi guys, in this video we're going to answer the question, how realistic is the possibility of civil war in the United States? America is beset by a level of social unrest and political polarization not seen in over 50 years, with some protests turning into riots and armed militias taking to the streets, while politicians are inciting violence, and with many people unlikely to accept the election results regardless of who wins. Academics have pointed out that the country has reached civil war level divisions. And this raises the question, will this social unrest boil over and escalate into something more? What long-term trends and short-term factors could make this more likely? What is the cause of this social unrest, and could the election be a tipping point? In short, is America headed for civil war, or something else altogether? A civil war is defined as any internal conflict with at least 1,000 casualties per year of the conflict. So to determine if a conflict of that scale can happen in the United States, we have to look at a number of short-term factors, an immediate cause of the conflict, and some long-term trends, and we'll deal with them in that order. In the short term, a key factor will be civil unrest. 2020 has been a year of unprecedented social unrest, not seen since the civil rights era, and while the majority of the protests themselves have been peaceful, protesters have also clashed with police and right-wing militias, while some protests have turned into riots and looting, and right-wing militias have stormed the state capitol in Michigan in protest against coronavirus lockdown measures. At the same time, Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old Trump supporter, shot dead two protesters, allegedly in self-defense, while hundreds of Trump supporters poured into the city of Portland, openly shooting protesters with paintball guns and pepper spray, while a left-wing activist in Portland shot dead a Trump supporter. And a lone gunman in Los Angeles shot two policemen. If citizens are so willing to commit acts of violence against each other for having different political beliefs, it won't be long before paintballs are substituted for bullets. And this is even more pertinent in America, a country awash with guns. There are over 300 million guns in America, and in July of 2020, gun sales reached an all-time high, with almost 4 million gun background applications in just that month. When people begin arming themselves, that is a precursor for civil war. Keep in mind that you only need a small percentage of people, 2 to 5%, to actually be violent in order to start a violent conflict. Violent acts by one side are met with retaliation by the other, and soon tit-for-tat acts of violence become a downward spiral of chaos. And it doesn't help that the local police often take the side of armed right-wing militias and vigilante groups. In fact, before Kyle Rittenhouse shot protesters in the street, he and other right-wing militants were thanked by the police and given water bottles and strategic advice. And in New York, the police escorted Trump supporters into a car that later plowed through protesters. It's not just that the police are cozy with right-wing militias. Reports show that extreme right-wing groups have infiltrated the police force for decades. This toxic relationship between police and armed groups is only an invitation to escalate peaceful protests into violence and civil unrest into civil conflict. Another factor is the role of politicians and the media in inciting violence. It's all good and well having social unrest, but in order to escalate the violence, you need radicalization. In response to Kyle Rittenhouse shooting protesters, Fox News host Tucker Carlson justified it, while conservative activist Ann Coulter said he should be president. As for the right-wing militias who pepper-sprayed protesters in Portland, Trump praised them and called them great patriots. Trump's advisor, Kellyanne Conway, has openly admitted that Trump thinks violence will help him get re-elected. Presenting himself as the law and order candidate could help him, but the irony, of course, is that all the violence is happening on Trump's watch. So re-electing him would do nothing to stop the violence. After all, Trump is president right now. Whatever plan he has to stop the violence could already be implemented today. This lack of political leadership to calm things down and politicians openly inciting violence means that the situation can only escalate. Now add to this the economic situation. America is in a Great Depression. 30 to 40 million people are in danger of being evicted from their homes. Civil war tends only to occur when economic desperation outweighs the danger of being killed. People with nothing to lose are ripe for political radicalization and mass mobilization. Therefore, it's unsurprising that 34% of Americans believe that civil war is imminent within 5 years. All these short-term factors are ingredients for a dangerous cocktail. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The United States has had periods of social unrest before. The 60s saw political violence spike with riots, political assassinations, and lynch mobs. But the country did not devolve into civil war. And in fact, if you look at this graph, although there are more protests now than in the 1960s, a much smaller proportion of those protests are riots. And that's where the immediate trigger for the conflict comes into play. The most likely spark for any kind of civil conflict is what is called the red mirage election scenario. And it goes as follows. Democrats are twice as likely as Republicans to vote by mail, with 67% of those planning to vote by mail being Democrats. Mail-in ballots take much longer to count. So on election day, as all the in-person ballots are counted, just like a mirage, it will seem like Donald Trump is winning in an overwhelming electoral victory, and Trump will prematurely declare himself the winner before all the mail-in ballots have been counted. But then, as the days go by and the mail-in ballots, which are disproportionately Democrat, are counted, the election begins to swing in favor of Joe Biden. But Trump and his supporters have already declared victory and declared that the election has been rigged using mail-in ballots, while Joe Biden refuses to back down. Suddenly, you have an election in dispute. Just like in 2000, both the Trump and Biden campaigns will challenge the election results in court. But unlike in 2000, this will occur against the backdrop of massive polarization and social unrest. And so the inevitable result will be riots and massive social unrest. People will take to the streets insisting that their candidate won, and armed militias could spark outbreaks of violence. And because politicians on both sides have an incentive to keep their supporters mobilized and not back down and try to calm things down, the situation can only escalate. But even if this situation is resolved through the courts, whoever wins will have no mandate to rule and will be seen as illegitimate by the other side, which will tear American society apart and will lead to continuing social unrest. This scenario is very likely and is the perfect spark for civil conflict, or worse. But even without this scenario, chaos is likely. If Trump wins the Electoral College but loses the popular vote, as happened in 2016, do you think Democrats will accept minority rule twice in a row? On top of that, the very real prospect of Republicans suppressing the vote through tactics like shutting down polling stations, voter purging, and sabotaging mail-in ballots will ensure that Democrats will contest the election results. I discussed this in my video on how the election could be rigged, so check that out. One poll showed that if Trump won the Electoral College without winning the popular vote, almost 40% of Democrats say that the election ought to be rerun. A Trump victory will fundamentally undermine the legitimacy and authority of the federal government, which is likely to spark riots and worse. At the same time, with a Biden victory, Trump will not accept the results of the election. He has consistently tried to undermine the credibility of the election and claims that it will be rigged.
They're trying to rig this election.
Many of his supporters, including armed militias, will take to the streets, and Trump will encourage them and incite violence. Whichever way the election goes, neither side will accept the results, and for both sides, the other candidate winning is not just a political disagreement, but it is an existential threat to the nation. Democrats see a Trump victory as an impending fascist takeover and the end of democracy, while Republicans see a Joe Biden victory as a takeover by the radical left and the end of law and order. When one side cannot stomach the possibility of the other side winning, then violence becomes the only means of achieving political goals. America is fast headed toward this state. But to really understand whether we are headed for some kind of civil conflict or civil war, we have to look at the long-term factors that make civil war more or less likely. These factors predate the Trump presidency. Back in 2010, using mathematical modeling, Professor Peter Turchin predicted that in the year 2020 there will be massive social unrest. With that accurate prediction, Peter Turchin has now predicted that civil unrest and political instability is likely to last for the next 10 to 15 years. One of the key long-term factors is polarization. I explain in detail in my video why America is so polarized, the causes of this polarization. The danger of this polarization is that the American system doesn't work with it. Either you need a governing majority in all branches of government, or you need bipartisanship and compromise. But in an increasingly polarized environment, neither party is willing to cooperate or compromise, creating massive gridlock and ensuring that nothing gets done. This creates dissatisfaction with the political system, which breeds massive social unrest. And as both sides become polarized, the other side is increasingly seen as the enemy, while dehumanization of the other side makes political violence an increasingly attractive way to solve disputes. And because politicians stand to gain by sowing division and appealing to tribal loyalties, while the media profits from controversy, polarization only increases. But much of this polarization is facilitated and exacerbated by demographic changes. It's no secret that the demographics in America are changing. Demographers predict that non-Hispanic whites will be 49% of the population by 2045. In other words, they will no longer be the majority. Demographic changes introduce new groups who make new demands upon the traditional power groups, and so demographic change can make people who were once the archetypes of their culture feel irrelevant because they fear a loss of the cultural status they once had. The combination of polarization and demographic change means that Democrats have had to become more explicit about racial justice and appealing to minorities, while Republicans have had to double down on white identity. The fact that a declining white population is being framed as a good thing by some on the left, rather than the neutral thing that it is threatening to many whites. Threatening people's identity in this way only causes them to dig their heels in further. Research shows that telling whites that they will become a minority makes them more likely to vote for Trump, more likely to support conservative positions, and makes them view minorities less favorably. And the effect also applies to white liberals. Demographic change is often among the causes of civil war. In Lebanon, the loss of a Christian majority in a political system that entrenched Christian dominance and increasing demands for political power by Muslims led to civil war. In Northern Ireland, a declining Protestant majority at the same time as demands for civil rights for Catholics led to the Troubles, a 30-year period of civil conflict. This fear of being outnumbered is especially strong in a democracy because it means not just being outnumbered, but outvoted. And if you are feeling outnumbered, then the only way to maintain power is through minority rule, and so democracy becomes the enemy. So it's not surprising that 50% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents believe that the traditional way of American life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. Essentially, when a historically dominant majority fears losing power and doesn't want to share power, that can lead to conflict. But none of this would matter if America's political institutions were not wholly perverted. Republicans' xenophobic appeals to a shrinking white conservative demographic would normally be punished at the ballot box. But this isn't happening because of the nature of the electoral system. Republicans are able to keep winning despite only appealing to a minority white conservative demographic through a combination of voter suppression, the Senate, and the Electoral College. You see, as the country grows more diverse, the representation in politics will become worse, not better. By 2040, 70% of Americans will live in 15 out of the 50 states, and 50% will live in just 8 states. Therefore, the Electoral College will become even less responsive to the popular vote. Republicans could win the Electoral College while losing the popular vote by 6 or 7 million votes, rather than the 500,000 vote difference between Gore and Bush, or the 3 million vote difference between Clinton and Trump. 30% of Americans will elect 70 out of the 100 senators. With such a divided system, the division and gridlock you saw during the Obama and Trump era will look like child's play. and nothing will get done. And at the same time, the massive amounts of money coming from billionaires and special interests that goes to both parties means that regardless of who wins, the will of the majority is often not implemented anyway, producing a deep frustration with the political system and with both parties. When people believe that change is no longer possible through the ballot box, then they may begin to believe that change is possible through the barrel of a gun. In this way, the fundamental legitimacy of the system is challenged when a dwindling minority gets to elect the president and the Senate, while increasingly larger majorities are required for Democrats to win. This is an unsustainable system, and people will only accept it for so long. It has to be reformed, or it will continue to destabilize the country. That being said, the vast majority of Americans, almost 4 out of 5, still reject violence against the other party. But this number is going down, and only a small number of people are needed to sow the seeds of conflict. At the same time, America does not have the same sharp geographical divisions between states that existed before the first American Civil War. If you look at a map of the election results by county, you see that the real difference is not between states, but between cities and rural areas. However, if you look, for example, at the Lebanon Civil War, the lack of sharp geographical boundaries between different groups did not stop the outbreak of civil war. In fact, it made it more deadly. Okay, but we shouldn't be looking at developing countries with weak central governments as a predictor for civil war in America. My take is that rather than outright civil war, more likely is a period of violence and political instability on the level of, or worse than in the 1960s. Rather than open war, imagine something more like what happened in another developed country, the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The Troubles were a 30-year period of low-level violence with outbursts between Protestant Unionist militias and Catholic nationalist militias, and the Protestant militias were often covertly supported by the British Army. And this combination of shootings, riots, political assassinations, and terrorist bombs resulted in the deaths of about 3,500 people over a 30-year period, with almost 50,000 injured. Worst case scenario, something similar could happen in the United States, with riots, armed militias going at each other, shootings, assassinations, and the local police working with right-wing militias, something which is already happening. It will not be open civil war, that's hyperbolic. The necessary geographical divisions don't exist, and the army is not likely to split along partisan lines. States are not about to secede over an election result, and the central government has not lost control. Instead, expect as a worst-case scenario a protracted, low-level civil conflict with localized outbursts of violence between conservative and liberal communities, rather than open warfare between states. The combination of polarization, demographic change, and institutional failure in the long term, and social unrest, the arming of militias, collaboration with police, the economic situation, and incitement by politicians in the short term, could be triggered by a disputed election to become something ugly. Only a landslide victory can ensure that the election won't be contested, while only far-reaching structural reforms can fix the electoral system and address the grievances that are causing social unrest. America is headed for the Troubles, and it is incumbent upon Americans to stop it. To understand why America is so polarized, check out my last video. Consider becoming a Patreon to support more of these kind of videos. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.